Hello friends, I am Hardik Patel. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I am going to talk about the chain of responsibility design pattern and we will implement one of the example in Python technology. So this pattern is a behavioral design pattern and it allows us to pass a request object through the chain of objects until one of them handles it. Okay, so this pattern consists of three elements: handler, request and chain. So handler is an object that can handle a request. A request is an object that represents a task or some information. So based on that, the task will be performed. The chain is a linked list of this handler objects. So basically that request goes through that chain one by one handler. So this is how this pattern works. Basically what happens in this pattern is that when a request is sent to a chain, the chain will pass the request to the first handler in the list, and if the first handler can handle the request, it will do and return response. Okay, and if it is not able to do the work, then it will pass that request to the next handler in the list, and this process will continue and it go up to the end of the chain. So this pattern can be used to handle many variety of request workflows such as logging request. So if you want to have your logging request to be handled by multiple handlers like file handler, database handler, email handler, right? So this is another use case. Then authentication request. So in authentication request, what you want to do? So suppose you have three different authentication classes and your request coming from different interfaces. Probably one interface using session authentication, and then second interface is using token authentication, and you are also providing basic authentication facility as well. So you don't know from where the request is coming, but you have made a chain, so it goes through that chain and decides which authentication gets successful, and according to that you will go further. Okay, then similar to that, we have authorization request you can also implement. So their chain of a responsible pattern can be used to authorize request to access different resources. Okay, so in this example, I have implemented the code. Basically I wanted to write a code in the video, but it can take a lot of time. I tried once, it almost took 20 minutes while explaining that video. Okay, so I have already written that and I'm going to explain one by one. Okay, so what we have to implement first, that is chain. But to make a chain, you also need to have handler first. So we are going to create one abstract handler class. This is handler. We have mentioned that meta class attribute, so this class is going to be considered as a meta class, and we also mentioned this abc meta. Now what we need is that just to implement handler, we need authenticate method. So that handler class, suppose we are talking about these three authentication classes: basic authentication, session authentication and token authentication, and they have only one responsibility, is that to authenticate the request. Okay, so that is the one method we have put it as an abstract method. So all child classes should have implemented that. So as you can see, we have implemented three concrete handlers. One is basic authentication, session authentication and token authentication. As you can see, in each authentication class, authentication method, what we have done, we are not going to actually authenticate the request because this is not a real program, this is not a real project, right? This is just an explanation. So I have just used common logic that in basic authentication what we have is username and password. So if they are provided in request object, then I am just marking it as a authenticated request. So I am adding one attribute in the request object as true and just printing that this request is authenticated using basic authentication. Same way for session authentication, we are just checking session key is existing in request object, then we are doing the same thing, just printing by session authentication. Same for token, if token keys exist inside the request, then we are doing the same thing. Okay, so this is we talked about handler. So handler objects are done. Now what is request, that we will talk about later, because when we are going to call this chain, at that moment we need to have request. But before that, we need to know how we can build these handlers into the chain. So to build the chain, what we have done here is that we have added two more classes. One is initialize class, initialize method, where we have just said this next handler is none. So whenever we instantiate any of this class, automatically next handler attribute will be set to that object, and that will be set to none. But if we are going to set any next handler, like for this basic authentication, you are going to set next handler as a session authentication, right? So what you will need to do is you have to implement the set next method inside the base class, and you just set this next handler is whatever you are going to pass in argument as a handler, right? So now you have the facility to build this chain. So before building the chain, I also want to explain this run method. So what happens here is that first, whenever you create a chain, you know that what is the root of that chain. So here we have a root of this chain is basic authentication. So whatever object of basic authentication is there, we are going to call the method of that object. So run is a method which we have implemented here. So which is not which is common method actually in this whole chain. This is not implemented by each and every authentication class. So what we have done here, so whenever this run method is called, first it will try to call authenticate method of the self. And what is self? Is the basic authentications object. So it will try to call this authenticate method. And once it is completed, what we are doing here is that we are just checking if that request is authenticated attribute is or not. If it is there and if it is true, then we are going to check next that if next handler is there, then we will call it the next handler's run method, else we will say request is not authenticated. So what we have done here is, if it is not authenticated, then we will call next handler, and if there is no next handler, in case of token authentication, we will not have any next handler, right? So we will have to handle this kind of request where there is no handler can handle this request. So in that case, we will print request is not authenticated. Okay, so now if you see here, this is how we are going to create objects of those handler classes. One is auth chain, because I have give this name because this is the root of this chain is going to be. And then we have also instantiated two more classes like session authentication and token authentication. Now we have all handlers object. Now we need to build the chain. So how we build the chain? So auth chain should have a next handler set. So we are going to call set next method, and we will call it session authentication. And session authentication should have next handler as a token authentication. So we call it set next, and then token authentication as an argument. So this is how this chain is built now. Now what and how, let's test it and we will see how it works. Okay, so request is like this. First we are just setting username and password inside this object. So it should automatically give us that as authenticated by basic authentication itself, because we are providing username and password both. So let's run it and check. So as you can see here, this request is authenticated using basic authentication. Okay, now if I change, if I do not provide password and instead I provide session. Okay, so as you know, for basic authentication you need username and password both. So if you are not providing password, that means basic authentication will not work. Now it will go to the next authentication class and it will check if session does exist, then it will authenticate it by session authentication in our case. Okay, let's run it and see. So as you can see, this request is authenticated using session authentication, right? Now let's run it using token now and run it. So as you can see, now this time it went to the token authentication and it failed. So if you want to see if it is going each and every classes or not, we can, I think, print that entered basic authentication. Okay, and I will copy paste each, just I will change the name, session and then token. Okay, now if I'll run this, If you see here, enter basic authentication, session authentication and token authentication, and the request is authenticated using token authentication. But if I go back and just change it to password now, what will happen? It will get out from basic authentication itself, because it will not go to the next authentication classes. Let's run it. Yeah, as you can see, it entered basic authentication and this request is authenticated using basic authentication itself. Now if I do not provide any, it should fail. We should check that case as well. No authentication class should be able to handle this request, right? So in that case, what will happen? It will enter each and every authentication class, and then finally it will say this request is not authenticated, because none of them was able to handle that request. Okay, so this is how you can implement this chain of responsibility design pattern. So let's talk about advantages. So as you know that here, that single responsibility principle comes into the picture here, because if you see here, basic authentication class which has only one responsibility to authenticate the request using username and password. If you want to add another authentication class, suppose JWT authentication, then what you will need to do, you just need to add another class, and that will have only single responsibility of having JWT authentication only. And as you see here, that we are not touching existing workflow, that means we are also following open close principle, correct? And it also increases the flexibility because you do not need to, you just add one class and it happens automatically. So what are the disadvantages? I can see one disadvantage is that it becomes difficult to debug code, because when you are going to have longer chains. And another disadvantage I can say is that it might affect the system's performance because of the continuous cycle calls. As you can see here, in that case, it called all three classes, if you see here, and still it was not able to fulfill the request. So you have to use this carefully. You cannot use each and every places. So processing several handlers in order, if you have that kind of scenario, then you can use this. Then you want to decouple some request, like so this method is generally used when you want to decouple the request sender and receiver. And when you don't want to specify handlers in the code, it is always preferred to use a chain of responsibility. So that's pretty much from this video. If you have liked this video, please hit the like button. Please subscribe my channel and also hit the bell icon, because I'm going to add a lot more videos going forward, so you will get the notification. So thank you very much for watching this video, and see you soon in the next one.